So we actually, for me, it's one of the most exciting from physiological standpoint topics of conversation. So I want to remind you about regulation of reproductive function in males. Males. I'm not even going to draw it. Hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing. Pituitary produces gonadotropins. And testes produce androgens. Very like in the nutshell. And then, no pun intended. No pun intended. And then testosterone inhibits the whole axis back. So very straightforward. In females, hypothalamus, same, yeah, here, right there, okay, produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, stimulates production of gonadotropins, FSH and LH, from the anterior pituitary. Now, FSH, follicle stimulating, what does it stimulate? It's follicle stimulating. What does it stimulate? Follicles, right? Because it's follicle stimulating. So it stimulates follicular development directly. Luteinizing hormone stimulates thecal cells that surround the oocyte in the follicle. They produce androgens. Don't focus too much on the thecal cells and granulosa cells. I'm not going to ask this. What you need to understand is that luteinizing hormone stimulate production of estrogen in the end. So estrogen increases. Does that make sense? Here's the bummer. Estrogen inhibits this whole thing. So estrogen inhibits anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. So levels of GnRH and gonadotropins are low. But here's the deal. What happens to the follicle in terms of the size when it grows? It's simple. What happens? It becomes bigger. And it becomes bigger because there are more thecal and granulosa cells. And what do they produce in the very end? What do they produce? Thecal and granulosa cells. What do they produce? Estrogen. So the more cells you have, the more estrogen they produce, despite of the low levels of gonadotropins. Does that make sense? So gonadotropins are low, but estrogen levels keep climbing up, slowly but steadily. And this is follicular phase. At some point, the levels, when follicle becomes, turns into the vesicular follicle, levels of estrogen become so high that instead of that negative feedback, the whole system switches to positive feedback. And estrogen starts to stimulate luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone starts to stimulate estrogen. Estrogen starts to stimulate luteinizing hormone. There's a surge in luteinizing hormone. And FSH actually follows. Okay? And this is the moment of ovulation. Immediately after the ovulation, well, the day, okay, what used to be a follicle becomes corpus luteum. Corpus luteum starts to produce huge amount of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Does that make sense? Eventually, this hormone reaches pituitary and hypothalamus and inhibits GnRH and gonadotropins. Does that make sense? Now, what happens to corpus luteum with time? It deteriorates in about 2 weeks. When corpus luteum is gone, what happens to these hormones? Progesterone, estrogen, inhibin? They're gone, right? They're gone. Since they are gone, nothing inhibits this anymore, and the cycle starts over. Does Does that make sense? Now I want to show you the graph. So it puts it in a better perspective in my opinion. So these are gonadotropins on top of the slide, and on the bottom of the slide you have gonadal hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So look at this. Levels of luteinizing hormone and FSH are fairly low because estrogen here inhibits them. Progesterone is practically non-existent. Does that make sense? As the follicle grows, level of estrogen climbs up. And right before the ovulation, that incredibly high level of estrogen switches negative feedback to positive and initiates the surge in LH. That is ovulation. Does it make sense? So this is the moment when secondary oocyte is released. Immediately after that, levels of gonadotropins decline because the whole system switches to negative feedback again, and corpus luteum here produces this huge amounts of estrogen and progesterone. Do you see that? So estrogen is elevated, progesterone is elevated. Now these hormones are coming from corpus luteum. Are we clear? Are we clear? Right? Corpus luteum eventually deteriorates in a so-called corpus albicans or corpus albicans. These hormones go down right here, and the whole cycle starts over again. Got it? So I think I have like another. Now, this cycle, ovarian cycle, can you stop it? How? That's not what nature intended. Fertilization or birth control, yes. So, to understand how it differs in case the secondary oocyte is fertilized, we need to look at the menstrual cycle. So basically, let's like rise above this and think about physiological purposes of these two cycles. What is the physiological purpose of ovarian cycle? Simple. To produce what? Oocyte. That's it, right? Regularly produce oocyte. What's the purpose of menstrual cycle? Until menses, before menses. To prepare what? To prepare uterus for the implantation of fertilized ovum. Does that make sense? So, if there is no fertilization, usually the menstrual cycle is counted from the time of menses here. So that's the time when stratum functionalis is shed. That's menstrual bleeding. Okay, at this point, estrogen levels are low, progesterone levels are low. That menstrual phase occurs in the beginning of follicular phase of ovarian cycle. Does that make sense? Now, look here. Sorry. Here. Estrogen starts to rise. And that's the beginning of proliferative phase. Proliferation means what? When something proliferates. Gets bigger, grows, right? It grows. So, stratum functionalis of uterus starts to grow. Okay? And then after the ovulation, estrogen levels still remain pretty up, and progesterone levels start to rise. At this point, right after the ovulation, menstrual cycle enters its secretory phase, mostly due to the progesterone. Now, in the proliferative phase, the growth of stratum functionalis is accompanied by the thinning of mucus plug that exists at the cervix, the uterus. So if you will picture uterus something like this, okay, and this is cervix, this is plug. This mucus plug, cervical plug, prevents sperm from getting into the uterus and then into the fallopian tubes. Around ovulation, this plug thins, preparing uterus and, well, basically uterus, allowing sperm, in case there is sperm, to pass through the uterus. Does that make sense? And everything is ready to accept the sperm, and ovulation happens. So secondary oocyte is in the fallopian tubes. During the secretory phase, stratum functionalis becomes functional due to the progesterone release. Okay? That's when it is ready to implant fertilized ovum. And at this point, cervical mucus plug is formed again to prevent any other potential sperm cells to get in and mess everything up, and to prevent potentially the blastocyst to get out of the uterus. On top of that, we're going to mention it, but progesterone at this point, it also prevents uterine contractions. So uterine doesn't accidentally pushes the fertilized ovum out. Now, if there is no fertilization, look at this. No fertilization, corpus luteum degrades, levels of progesterone decrease, and the whole system, the uterus, enters menstrual phase. And in my opinion, nature sometimes, you expect nature to be elegant. This is the opposite of elegant, in my opinion. I mean, regulation is elegant, but the way to get rid of unnecessary secretory phase is what? Spiral arteries severely constrict. And basically, the whole layer, stratum functionalis, becomes ischemic. And cells die. How do you get rid of those dead cells to replace them with the fresh ones? Spiral arteries dilate. Think about this. If you would, so imagine that this layer, this whole thing, is dead now, including arteries. When they dilate like they open up. So they don't, like, they broken essentially. Does that make sense? So that creates basically what humans do, females do, what the organisms do. They flush the dead tissue with the blood. I mean, that's pretty brutal, but the whole point is to get rid of the dead stratum functionalis and prepare the fresh one for the new round of possible implantation of fertilized ovum. That makes sense? Now I'm going to ask you questions. My questions will be focused on what's going on in the menstrual cycle, what happens in the proliferative stage, what happens in the secretory stage, what happens in the I'm not going to ask you what happens in the menstrual stage. It's kind of obvious. I'm going to ask you about ovarian cycle. For ovarian cycle, please focus on these 4 hormones. Am I clear? So say I ask you, during the luteal stage, levels of hormones are as follows. And you think, both gonadotropins are low, progesterone and estrogen are high. Does that make sense? Things like that, like very basic. Okay? Am I clear? Like, what happens during ovulation? Surge in estrogen causes the surge of luteinizing hormone. I will focus my questions on the hormonal regulation of the ovarian cycle. There will be some of them. Good? Now, very briefly, very briefly, if oocyte is fertilized, if oocyte is fertilized, corpus luteum doesn't degenerate and keeps producing progesterone for an extended period of time. And that, so instead of seeing this, you're going to see this in progesterone. Does that make sense? If it's fertilized. Progesterone is going to... So corpus luteum stays working, giving away progesterone. Progesterone keeps stratum functionalis. So blastocyst can implant. So the role of hormones. Well, estrogen. Yes?
Once the placenta implants, does it degrade then?
Oh, yeah. Corpus luteum will go away in like 2 months or something. Yeah, I think it's about, I don't remember if it's a month or 2, but it's somewhere in that ballpark, time-wise. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't stay for all 9 months. Now, roles, physiological roles. Estrogen, similar functionally to testosterone. Secondary sex characteristics, increased bone density, growth, calcium uptake. It controls the integrity of the bones. Widening of the hips. Now look, I don't want to narrow down the entire human, like all the social roles that we play to biology. But it actually is fascinating, the physiological changes in the female body. Well, growth of breasts. Why? Because they need to feed the offspring. Widening of the hips. Why? To accommodate for the fetus. Subcutaneous fat. Why? There's something is wrong with the food supply. They have enough fat to feed the fetus and provide for the baby. Does that make sense? So all those changes are directly associated with the reproductive function. Progesterone, mostly, it's produced, elevated during the pregnancy, in the initial stages. It keeps implanted blastocyst functional, not decreases the uterine motility, so it doesn't expel the embryo. It regulates that mucus, cervical mucus, to allow sperm and not allowing sperm. And it also stimulates lactation. Not directly, it kind of prepares during pregnancy, prepares breasts for lactation. So, menopause occurs in women around the age of 50, 55, 60, it depends, it's very individual. Hormonal regulation changes, estrogen levels decline dramatically. Usually it's associated with a decreased calcium uptake and osteoporosis. Also can be associated with a high risk of cardiovascular disease due to the lowering of good cholesterol. Complete lack of estrogen, as lack of testosterone in males, leads to the atrophy of reproductive organs, hot flashes, skin thinning, bone loss. Now, treatment. I think we discussed it a little bit. Hormone replacement therapy was one of the highest grossing, money grossing drugs in the 80s until it was very convincingly demonstrated that it increases risk of the breast cancer, heart disease, and stroke in women dramatically. And of course, you can kind of ameliorate heart disease and stroke by lifestyle changes. You cannot do anything about breast cancer. It's either there or not. Okay? And it increase the risk a lot. So now, this therapy is not used. Sometimes in a very, very short term, if a woman is not at risk for breast cancer. So initially when it was introduced, it's like, oh, just take it through the entire thing. Like, just keep taking it. And then it turned out to be not a good thing for women. Now, what happens in fertilization? There's one event that I like specifically. So this is secondary oocyte. And you can think of it as like an old style romantic comedy or romantic movie. So secondary oocyte is a female cell, right? Cell that comes from female. And it doesn't want to do anything with sperm cells. It even surrounded itself with a layer of proteins called corona radiata, which is practically impenetrable. Okay? So secondary oocyte enters, it's not ovum, sorry. It's secondary oocyte. Enters the fallopian tube. Okay? And it travels through fallopian tube. At the same time, sperm that is in the vagina and then travels to uterus, it's capacitated. Usually calcium plays a really important role in capacitation. Basically, capacitation means that sperm is truly functional and ready to fertilize. There are some biochemical changes. So eventually, sperm and secondary oocyte meet in the fallopian tube. At the very tip of the sperm cell, I don't want to go all the way back to the picture of sperm cell, but if this is the sperm cell, here on top, there's this part that is called acrosome. It contains proteolytic enzymes that destroy corona radiata. Does that make sense? So, sperm cell, probably more than one, they release acrosomal enzymes. Corona radiata disassembles, and at this point, sperm cells can interact with the receptors, the outer layer of oocyte called zona pellucida. Then, sperm cell enters the oocyte. And the next event, for some reason, I find it fascinating. This entry leads to the diffusion of calcium into the cell. And calcium in the cell. Remember, I don't know if you remember the nervous system, but in neuron, when calcium enters the neuron, it leads to the release of neurotransmitter in the vesicles. Here it's not neurotransmitter. It's the release of cortical granules. And cortical granules basically shut the door behind that sperm cell. They make membrane of the fertilized ovum impenetrable to other sperm cells. Does that make sense? So that champion that entered first shuts the door behind itself. So there is not more than one sperm cell per one oocyte. Because otherwise, that would be a catastrophe. it would be, say, trisomy of all chromosomes. To be honest, that can happen. In case of polyspermy, so multiple, like 2 sperm cells entering one oocyte, this type of fertilized ovum does not survive. Triggers apoptosis and it dies. Does that make sense? So at this point, when after the fertilization, meiosis II is completed, it's now ovum, and genomes mix here. They mix, and they form new nucleus, so it's normal. Now, this forms zygote, and the zygote is completely diploid. Everything's fine. Does that make sense? Now, a few words like the twins, identical twins, they come from the division of fertilized ovum, division and separation into 2 independent, basically, ova, right? Fraternal twins is 2 secondary oocytes that are independently fertilized by 2 sperm cells. We always joke that the fact that we have twins is completely like, that's my wife's achievement. I have nothing to do with it. Because indeed, that's woman. Number of oocytes that are released, that's entirely woman. Because as we just discussed, males have as many as needed. Thousands of sperm cells can make its way to the...
Is it possible to have fertilized like at different times?
How different?
Like if one was supposed to
Different fathers?
well that and like if one was supposed to be born in like 8 months and then the other one was supposed to be born in like 6 months, like that.
Not that far. Not that far. I think there were some examples when, but it was basically intercourses separated by, say, a day. But there were examples of fraternal twins where each twin was conceived from different father. But it's super rare. I mean, you cannot, it's going to sound absolutely terrible. You cannot aim for that. You know, like not, you probably just, it's impossible to, like, trying to deliberately achieve that. Okay? There were examples. Yes. So, this is fertilization. And then fertilized ova, fertilized egg, is slowly moving into the uterus. Interesting thing about the cell division blastocyst is that, remember, it doesn't become bigger. It is partitioned inside. I don't remember how many rounds it goes, but it goes from one cell, so same volume, but from 1 cell, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 16 cells, they become smaller and smaller. Okay? And finally, you know, that semi-developed blastocyst enters the uterus. What happens in the uterus? There are cells called trophoblasts. Basically, trophoblasts, they eat their way into the endometrium. They destroy endometrium to make a site for implantation of blastocyst. Okay? Progesterone is necessary to facilitate the transport of nutrients. Okay? And actually, first, basically, 3 months, trophoblasts develop nutrients instead of placenta. I'm trained initially, like my major training in microbiology, okay? And for me, trophoblasts are fascinating in a different way. I spoke today about this. Trophoblasts also prevent transmission of infections from mother to child. They provide some kind of hardly penetrable barrier between mother's blood and baby's blood. Okay? The placental trophoblasts. Now the deal is, protein that makes this barrier comes from the virus. So we were infected, like, I don't know, hundreds, I don't know, mammals actually got infected with that virus, and they developed placenta. And think about this from evolutionary standpoint. Placenta is good because it allows fetus to develop inside of mother's body to the stage where newborn can practically be functional. I'm not talking about babies, but if you would look at, say, a lot of herbivores, newborn deer, newborn elephants, they ready to go in a matter of hours. They can't protect themselves, but at least they can walk around and, eat grass, basically. Well, not eat grass, but they can walk around, at least. Okay? They sort of functional. Human babies, not that much. Okay? But if you would compare this to non-placental mammals, such as marsupials, or I don't remember the name for platypi, but the egg-laying mammals, that's primitive. That's super primitive. Those eggs cannot survive by themselves, So, eventually placenta is formed, and placenta is quite an interesting structure here. So this is placenta, and I need to explain the main thing about placenta, which is blood flow. So this part, I will try to separate it by the green one. So this part it refers to mother, like this, what I just strike through. Okay, that's mother. So in the mother, I'm sorry, uterine arteries, shown here in red, they bring blood to the placenta. Do I make sense? So this blood is oxygen rich and everything as well. This blood enters, and that's actually, as far as I know, human placenta is rather primitive. Rodent placenta is much more complicated. Basically what happens, these arteries, they dump the blood into the sinuses. Does it make sense? So this is sinus. I'm going to strike sinus. Okay? Uterine veins take the blood away from placenta, and this blood is oxygen poor because oxygen goes to fetal circulation. Does that make sense? Now, what happens in fetus? So in fetus forms villi. So this is villus. Okay? Does that make sense? This is huge villus with a network of arteries and veins. Now, let me ask you a question here. What is the difference between the artery and the vein? The only one fundamental difference. Say again? Not oxygenated. No. Direction-wise. Because some arteries do not carry oxygenated blood, right? Like pulmonary arteries, they carry deoxygenated. Arteries, anatomically, away from the heart. Veins are to the heart. Period. Umbilical arteries and veins are like pulmonary arteries and veins. Umbilical arteries go from the fetal heart to the placenta, but they carry deoxygenated blood. Does that make sense? In the placental villus, so this is artery. Can you see the artery? It's blue here on the picture. Umbilical artery is blue. Okay, that's that. The blue one. We good? They carry deoxygenated blood to the placenta, where it's getting oxygenated, and umbilical veins take the blood back to the growing fetus. Does that make sense? So umbilical arteries and umbilical veins, they're like pulmonary. Are we good? Are we clear about it? We're good. Why? There is unloading. So partial pressure of oxygen in the maternal blood in the sinuses here isn't that high, because blood in the sinuses is always mixed, right? There's no separation, so this oxygenated blood from the mother enters here, and here you have deoxygenated blood. So of course there's not going to be like clear separation. There's going to be some sort of a mix. So partial pressure of oxygen in the sinus is 50 millimeters of mercury. Partial pressure of oxygen in the fetal blood that gets to the sinus, deoxygenated one, is 30. So difference isn't striking. The question is, what facilitates the transport of oxygen? It's called double Bohr effect. CO2 goes from fetal blood to mother's blood. When CO2 leaves fetal blood, how does it change pH of the fetal blood? It goes up. pH in mother's blood goes, it accepts CO2 and it goes down. Lower pH in mother's blood facilitates oxygen unloading. Increased pH in fetal blood facilitates oxygen binding. So you have two Bohr effects on each side. Does that make sense? On top of that, fetal hemoglobin has higher affinity to oxygen. Does that make sense? So like two things. First, CO2 transfer and higher affinity to oxygen and all. So that all facilitates the oxygen transport. Now, 3 hormones for pregnancy that I want you to know, and I want you to know it in a very simple manner. In the beginning, I'm not like, basically, I'm not going to ask like 94th day of pregnancy, God forbid. Basically, beginning like first trimester. Chorionic gonadotropin. Pregnancy test, the stick, that's what it determines. Human chorionic gonadotropin. Does that make sense? So that's when it's high. Progesterone and estrogen are relatively low. Late in pregnancy, in the 3rd trimester, estrogen and progesterone is high. Human chorionic gonadotropin is relatively low. Know it at this level. Am I clear? Good. So gonadotropin, chorionic gonadotropin. In the very beginning, it maintains corpus luteum, which maintains estrogen and progesterone levels. Okay. Does everything that you need to keep the embryo alive, meaning no menstruation, nutrient delivery, decidual cell development, which deliver nutrients. Progesterone, basically the same. Okay, nutrients, decreased contractility of uterus, so embryo is not expelled. preparation for milk production. Estrogen stimulates growth of uterus and breasts. Uterus to accommodate for a growing fetus, and breasts to be more efficient in the milk production. Special hormone that I don't have here, somatomammotropin, which is not in the picture, it stimulates breast development, basically. Okay? Increases availability of glucose for the fetus, but you can say somatomammotropin. Somato, body, mammo, breasts, tropin, stimulates breast growth. So, women gain weight during pregnancy. Main reason, fetus and accumulation of fat. Elevated amount of blood. This is the dynamic of blood accumulation in pregnancy. You see when fetus starts to become bigger and bigger, amount of blood in the female body increases to increase the transport of oxygen and nutrients to the placenta to maintain the growth. Okay? And there's some, for uterus, increased uterus size, increased breast size, but not so. Mainly it's fat and fetus. Okay? Now, conditions associated with the blood accumulation are preeclampsia and eclampsia. So preeclampsia in constantly increased blood pressure, which alters kidney function, leading to damage to the podocytes, presence of protein in the urine, which alters the whole filtration and reabsorption process, leading to increased retention of sodium and water, which increases blood pressure, which may lead to spasms in different arteries, and including uterine arteries, and can restrict blood flow to the fetus. Eclampsia is pretty much preeclampsia taken to the next level. So in this case, vasospasm becomes systemic, renal function decreases, which leads to basically toxicity, may lead to the coma. Preeclampsia is usually manifested initially by abnormally high, sustained high blood pressure. And that's the medical condition in which C-section is warranted. Even at the early stages of pregnancy. Now, physicians can manage to, I don't know the right English word, but make babies survive when they weigh like the pound and a half, basically. Really, really tiny. Okay. Delivery. I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about it. So, no, seriously. Seriously, it's always like, for me it's funny that I'm talking about it. So, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay? All I know is oxytocin. No, really. Okay? The deal is, estrogen, the most important thing I want to say. Estrogen. So think of estrogen stimulates contractions. Progesterone inhibits them. So it's teeter-totter. Before parturition, progesterone levels start to decrease. So estrogen takes over and it stimulates initial contractions. These contractions eventually stimulate oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates contractions. These contractions start to push baby forward. When baby's head pushes on the mechanoreceptors in the uterine cervix, signal goes back to produce more oxytocin. More oxytocin, more contractions. More push on the cervix, more oxytocin. more contractions. And that's positive feedback, goes on and on and on until baby's born. Does that make sense? So I know this positive feedback mechanism, just pretty basic. And when baby's out, there's no pressure, oxytocin levels decline, and all good. Now, the last thing I want to talk about quickly is production of milk. So there are two hormones that are involved, oxytocin and prolactin. So hypothalamus produces prolactin-releasing factors. They act on the anterior pituitary. That stimulates milk production. By milk production, here's the deal. What we mean here by milk production is actual making of milk in the breasts. Not release, just production. Does that make sense? Oxytocin released from posterior pituitary is necessary for contraction of lactiferous ductals in the breasts to contract and release, like basically squeeze milk out. Do you understand? There are two hormones. One, this one, is responsible for making milk. Oxytocin is responsible for releasing it. What is the stimulus? Suckling. So one of the, it's actually has a big physiological sense when baby is born to bring baby to mom so baby can start suckling on the breast, because that suckling action immediately stimulates the release of prolactin and release of oxytocin, and it produces milk and baby is fed, and then next time it's going to have the same effect. Does that make sense? So know the difference, functional difference between this axis and this axis. Am I clear? I try to outline what you need to focus on very specifically, and I will do the study guide, I promise. It will be study guide, and we're going to review the whole thing on Monday. There's a quiz right here, so you can overview it. Now,